My lord, I know that you've only come into power in your tender years because of your father's sudden death, but you've got to do something about your uncles, the Duke of Gloucester and the Bishop of Winchester. They're supposed to be your advisors, but the squabbling between those two could be as bad as one of the worst distractions any king could have to face. And although many of your nobles would love to be crowned king, they don't realize that it's the loneliest job in the world sometimes. You've got to regain your lost cities in France. Believe me when I tell you that when the commoners ask if you can live up to your noble father's combat experience, having to say no is going to be the saddest experience you'll ever know. And the only thing worse than those two squabbling uncles of yours is the two bickering Dukes of York and Somerset. They're supposed to be sending reinforcements to Lord Talbot, but instead they're too busy fighting each other. I realize that it's just no good anymore since you were a child and your father went away to fight wars in France. But like it or not, you've got 3 big tasks ahead of you. Now, I spend my time making strategies that work, so here are yours. Number 1, develop your own confident leadership style. Number 2, regain your lost towns in France. And number 3, stop all the infighting. Number 3 is the most immediate number to deal with because Gloucester and Winchester are your advisors. Number 2 is the most critical number because if you lose those territories in France, you'll prove the famous prophecy right. Still, at least you have your regents there to help you with that task. But trust me when I tell you that by far, number 1 is the loneliest number that you'll ever do. In his satirical 1726 novel Gulliver's Travels, author Jonathan Swift demonstrates the silliness of politics when 2 nations go to war over which end of an egg is the correct end to cut. But as petty and ridiculous as that may seem, in Henry VI Part 1, we see how the houses of Lancaster and York begin a 30-plus year conflict known as the War of the Roses over whether a red rose or a white rose is better. So let's take a look at the plot. The play begins at the funeral of Henry V, who has recently died unexpectedly in the prime of his life while fighting in France. His brothers, the Dukes of Bedford and Gloucester, and his uncle, the Duke of Exeter, lament his passing and express doubt as to whether his son, the as yet uncrowned heir apparent Henry VI, is capable of running the country in such tumultuous times. Word comes about military setbacks and the loss of several major towns in France, and that a rebellion led by Charles the Dauphin is gaining momentum. In addition, Lord Talbot, the Constable of France, has been captured. Realizing that the situation is very dire, Bedford immediately heads to France and takes command of the army, while Gloucester remains in charge of England, and Exeter sets out to prepare young Henry for his forthcoming coronation. Meanwhile, in Orleans, the English army lays siege to Charles's forces. Inside the city, the bastard of Orleans approaches Charles, telling him that there is a young woman who claims to have seen visions and knows how the French can defeat the English. Charles summons the young woman, Joan La Pucelle, who is actually Joan of Arc. To test her resolve, he challenges her to single combat. Upon her victory, he immediately places her in command of the army. At the same time, just outside the city, the newly arrived Bedford negotiates for the release of Talbot and is successful. However, Joan immediately launches an attack. The French forces win, driving the English back, but Talbot and Bedford plan a sneak attack on the city and gain a foothold within the walls, causing the French leaders to flee. Meanwhile, back in England, what started out as a petty quarrel between Richard Plantagenet, the Duke of York, and the Duke of Somerset has now expanded to involve the entire court. York and Somerset asked their fellow nobles to pledge their allegiance to one or the other, and to do so by each lord selecting either a red or a white rose to indicate which side they're on. York then goes to see his uncle, the dying Edmund Mortimer, who's been imprisoned in the Tower of London. Mortimer tells Richard the history of their family's conflict with the king's family and how they helped Henry Bolingbroke seize power away from Richard II, but were afterwards shoved into the background. He also explains how Henry V had Richard's father, Richard Earl of Cambridge, executed and his family stripped of all its lands and monies. Mortimer reveals that he himself is in fact the rightful heir to the throne, and that when he dies, Richard will be the true heir, not Henry. Amazed at these revelations, Richard is determined to re-establish his birthright and vows to have his family's dukedom restored. After Mortimer dies, Richard presents his petition to the recently crowned King Henry, who agrees to reinstate the Plantagenet's title, making Richard 3rd Duke of York. Henry immediately leaves for France, accompanied by Gloucester, Exeter, Winchester, Suffolk, Richard, and Somerset. In the meantime in France, within just a few hours, the French capture and then lose the city of Rouen. Unfortunately, after the battle, Bedford dies and Talbot assumes direct command of the army. Although Charles the Dauphin is discouraged after the loss of Rouen, Joan tells him not to worry. She then persuades the powerful Duke of Burgundy, who had been fighting for the English, even though he's French, to switch sides and join the French. Meanwhile, Henry arrives in Paris. When he learns of Burgundy's betrayal, he sends Talbot to speak with him. Henry then pleads for Richard and Somerset to put aside their petty conflict, but not realizing the implications of his actions, he chooses to wear a red rose, symbolically aligning him with Somerset and alienating Richard. Before he returns to England, Henry puts Richard in command of the infantry and Somerset in charge of the cavalry in hopes of securing a peace between them. Meanwhile, Talbot approaches Bordeaux, but walks into a trap as the French army outnumbers and surrounds him. Talbot sends word for reinforcements, but the conflict between York and Somerset causes them to hesitate and second-guess one another. As a result, neither of them send Talbot any help, and they both blame each other for the mix-up. The English army is subsequently destroyed, and both Talbot and his son are killed in the conflict. After the battle is over, Joan's visions desert her. She's captured by Richard, and after pleading for her life, and even saying that she's pregnant, she is nevertheless burned at the stake. At the same time, urged on by the Pope, Henry requests a peace. The French listen to the English terms, under which Charles is to be a viceroy to Henry, and reluctantly agree, although only with the intention of breaking the oath at a later date and expelling the English from France. Meanwhile, the Earl of Suffolk captures a young French princess named Margaret of Anjou, whom he plans to have marry King Henry so that Suffolk can dominate the king through her. Suffolk attempts to persuade Henry to marry Margaret. However, Gloucester, the Lord Protector, advises Henry Suffolk attempts to persuade Henry to marry Margaret. However, Gloucester, the Lord Protector, advises Henry against it, since Margaret's family has no... Suffolk attempts to persuade Henry to marry Margaret. However, Gloucester, the Lord Protector, advises Henry against it, since Margaret's family is not rich and provides no dowry. He explains that the marriage would not be advantageous to his position as king, and besides, Henry is already promised to the king's niece. Unfortunately, Henry is so taken by Suffolk's description of Margaret's beauty that he agrees to the proposal. The play ends as Suffolk heads back to France to bring Margaret to England, and Gloucester expresses his concerns for what the future may hold for England. When we return, we'll look at some of the remarkable characters in Henry VI Part 1. One thing that you're bound to discover about the history plays is that there is an overabundance of characters. In fact, it's not unusual for actors in these plays to take on several roles in order to cover every part. Also, be aware that many of these characters have more than one name, due to their titles, and that their titles sometimes change even within the same play. Henry VI becomes king at only 9 months old due to the untimely death of his father Henry V. Because he's so young, his uncle, the Duke of Gloucester, is named the Lord Protector. In essence, he is the King of England until the king comes of age to rule. However, even when Henry VI is old enough to rule, he's a weak leader, very effeminate, fearful, and unsure of himself. He's easily overruled by his lords, his uncle, the Bishop of Winchester, and especially Margaret when she becomes his queen later on in Henry VI Part 2. The Duke of Gloucester is a good Lord Protector, but his actions are usually thwarted by the meddling and self-serving Bishop of Winchester, who tries to cross him at every turn. In addition to Gloucester, the king has some other noble lords, including Lord Talbot, who is a heroic warrior assigned to control the uprisings in France. He's so fierce that his very name is used as a weapon to terrify the French. There's also the Duke of Bedford and the Earl of Salisbury, who have their king's best interest in mind. But other than them, most of the others are only interested in their own agendas and gaining power. Richard Plantagenet, also known as the Duke of York, and the Duke of Somerset cannot stop their quarreling with each other and almost single-handedly set off the War of the Roses and caused the death of Lord Talbot because of their infighting. The Earl of Suffolk captures Margaret of Anjou and is instantly captivated by her, but is prevented from marrying her when he remembers that he's already married. His plans to have Margaret marry Henry VI is done solely for his own self-interest and wreaks havoc over the future of the English throne. Edmund Mortimer is Richard Plantagenet's uncle, who should have been Richard II's heir to the throne instead of Henry IV. In his dying minutes, he reveals the truth to his nephew, who from there on in will also pursue the throne of England. And finally, Joan La Pucelle is actually Joan of Arc, the French leader who takes on the English troops in France. But remember that since this is a play written by an Englishman for an English audience, Shakespeare's character bears very little resemblance to the actual real-life saint. When we return, we'll look at some of the plot devices and memorable scenes from Henry VI Part 1. Unlike most of Shakespeare's plays, he used his plot devices very sparingly in this one. Obviously, there's a war. When you have a conflict, it allows you to demonstrate your character's strengths and flaws. You go from the extreme characters, such as the heroic Lord Talbot, who is selfless and courageous, the fearless Joan La Pucelle, also known as Joan of Arc, who is a much fiercer fighter than any of the French she leads, to the other extremes of Sir John Fastolf, who is an unapologetic coward whose actions caused the loss of 1,200 men and the capture of Talbot himself. There is also some prophecies in this play, and of course by now you should know that Shakespeare's prophecies almost always come true. First, the Duke of Exeter mentions in Act 3, Scene 1, "And I now fear that fatal prophecy which, in the time of Henry named V, was in the mouth of every sucking babe, that Henry born at Monmouth should win all, and Henry born at Windsor should lose all." And if that were not enough, Exeter continues in Act 5, Scene 1 after learning that Winchester has been made a cardinal. "What, is my Lord of Winchester installed and called unto a cardinal's degree? Then I perceive that will be verified Henry V did sometime prophesy, if once he come to be a cardinal, he'll make his cap co-equal with the crown." We also have the obligatory power struggle over the crown. The Duke of Gloucester is the Lord Protector, who is always being challenged by the Bishop of Winchester. It's so bad that Gloucester says that Winchester laid a trap to take his life at London Bridge. In addition, Richard Plantagenet, the Duke of York, and the Duke of Somerset continuously go at each other, dragging with them their followers, including the Earl of Suffolk, Warwick, and additional hangers-on. We see this acted out in Act 2, Scene 4 in the Temple Garden, and it starts out with men deciding who is more correct in the law, York or Somerset. And they decide this by picking either a white rose or a red rose to wear. And what's most absurd about this is Shakespeare never even tells us what the actual argument is about. Talk about making much ado about nothing. But the scene ends with the prophetic words of Richard Plantagenet. I dare say this quarrel will drink blood another day. However, in Act 2, Scene 5, we see that it's really Richard's uncle, Edmund Mortimer, who truly should have been Richard II's rightful successor to the throne, who stirs up the ambition in Richard Plantagenet that he cannot shake. I also want to go back to Act 2, Scene 3, a truly unforgettable scene in which the Countess d'Auvergne invites Lord Talbot to her castle, but intends to capture him instead. However, the clever Talbot strategically prepared for just such a trap. Once he blows his horn, his troops burst in, surrounding the Countess and her servants, and she submits to his will. We're also going to look at Act 4, Scene 5, in the turning point section of this episode. This is where Lord Talbot meets his young son John in the midst of a lopsided battle, and the two of them argue back and forth why neither of them will flee, and the two of them vow to live or die together in the fight. And finally, we have Act 5, Scene 5, in which the Earl of Suffolk meets Margaret of Anjou. At first, he wants to take her as his prisoner, but once he looks at her, he is awestruck at her beauty. So much so that he forgets that he's married. Don't you hate when that happens? Nevertheless, Suffolk comes up with a plan to have her marry Henry VI instead, allowing him great power over her and the king. Next up, we'll delve into some of the most powerful themes that run through Henry VI Part 1. As we've already discussed, it was prophesied in Henry V that since Henry VI had so many left in the charge of his management, that France would be lost. We see that prophecy played out in Henry VI Part 1, primarily due to all of the infighting among the English nobility. The Duke of Gloucester is a good leader. However, even though he's the Lord Protector, in essence, the king by proxy, the Bishop of Winchester is a thorn in his side and takes every opportunity to undermine Gloucester's authority. And unfortunately, the king is too young and inexperienced to get these grown-ups to play nice with each other. In Act 3, Scene 1, Henry tries to intervene between the two quarreling uncles, saying, Uncles of Gloucester and of Winchester, the special watchmen of the English weal, I would prevail, if prayers might prevail, to join your hearts in love and amity. Oh, what a scandal it is to our crown, that two such noble peers as ye should jar. Believe me, lords, my tender years can tell civil dissension is a viperous worm that gnaws at the bowels of the Commonwealth. Even though Henry is correct at what he's saying, the two uncles don't pay him much heed because he's so young and ineffective. Their actions reflect Henry's entire problem as a reigning king. He has the right and the responsibility to rule, but not the experience nor the leadership to do so effectively. In addition, Richard Plantagenet, the Duke of York, and the Earl of Somerset do not get along with each other. It's never clearly defined as to what the initial cause of the dispute was, but suffice it to say that they're willing to create a 30-plus year-long War of the Roses over their petty dispute. Their argument comes to a head when, in defiance of one another, neither side bothers to send any aid or troops to rescue Lord Talbot, who is a pawn in their childish bickering and pays the price with his own life. And finally, there's the Earl of Suffolk, who is so infatuated with Margaret of Anjou that he persuades Henry VI not to go ahead with his promised marriage to the daughter of the Earl of Armagnac, even though he is a near kinsman to Charles and brings a sumptuous dowry. And all this just so that he can have Margaret close enough to be his mistress and gain control and power in England. Now tell me, is this any way to run a monarchy? Despite all the petty squabbling, there are some impressive leaders in this play. Unfortunately, Henry VI isn't one of them. The Duke of Gloucester, the Duke of Bedford, the Earl of Salisbury, and Lord Talbot all put their country first. In fact, in one humorous scene, There's a soldier who just yells the name Talbot without even drawing his sword and collects all the spoils from the French soldiers who flee in terror just at hearing his name. But unfortunately, Bedford, Salisbury, and Talbot are all killed during the course of the play, leaving much chaos on the side of the English. On the French side, most of the nobility are depicted as a bunch of buffoons until they are whipped into a fighting force by Joan La Pucelle. She's an excellent fighter and motivational leader. The history plays aren't loaded with humor. However, when Joan of Arc convinces Burgundy to defect from the English and join the French, it demonstrates first how persuasive her language can be, and second, just how fickle and untrustworthy Shakespeare thought of the French. Listen to Burgundy's reply after hearing only a few words from Joan in Act 3, Scene 3. I am vanquished. These haughty words of hers have battered me like roaring cannon shot and made me almost yield upon my knees. Forgive me, country and sweet countrymen, and lords, accept this hearty, kind embrace. My forces and my power of men are yours. So farewell, Talbot, I'll no longer trust thee. And Joan says, done like a Frenchman, turn and turn again. We see that Shakespeare doesn't miss the opportunity to demonstrate how untrustworthy the French can be and have Joan confirm that she thinks so in her aside. When we return, we'll look at some of Shakespeare's most powerful lines in the play. I don't want to forget to share this quick line by the Duke of Bedford in Act 2, Scene 2, when he says, unbidden guests are often welcomest when they are gone. It reminds me of the saying that house guests and fish both begin to smell after 3 days. One of the most remarkable exchanges in the entire play takes place in Act 4, Scene 5 between Lord Talbot and his son John. Talbot wants his son to escape and live, but John refuses to leave his father. Listen to their heroic and selfless exchange, which finally ends with both of them agreeing to stay and fight together no matter what happens. Talbot says, "O young John Talbot, I did send for thee to tutor thee in stratagems of war, that Talbot's name might be in thee revived, when sapless age and weak unable limbs should bring thy father to his drooping chair. But O malignant and ill-boding stars, now thou art come unto a feast of death, a terrible and unavoided danger. Therefore, dear boy, mount on my swiftest horse, and I'll direct thee how thou shalt escape by sudden flight. Come, dally not, be gone." And his son says, "Is my name Talbot, and am I your son, and shall I fly? Oh, if you love my mother, dishonor not her honorable name to make me a bastard and a slave of me. The world will say he is not Talbot's blood, that basely fled when noble Talbot stood. Fly to revenge my death if I be slain. He that flies so will ne'er return again. If we both stay, we both are sure to die. Then let me stay, and father, do you fly. Your loss is great, so your regard should be. My worth unknown, no loss is known in me. Upon my death the French can little boast. In yours they will, in you all hopes are lost. Flight cannot stain the honor you have won, but mine it will that no exploit have done. You fled for vantage, everyone will swear, but if I bow, they'll say it was for fear. There is no hope that ever I will stay, if the first hour I shrink and run away. Here on my knees I beg mortality, rather than life preserved with infamy. Shall all thy mother's hopes lie in one tomb? Ay, rather than I'll shame my mother's womb. Upon my blessing I command thee go. To fight I will, but not to fly the foe. Part of thy father may be saved in thee, no part of him, but will be shame in me. Thou never hadst renown, nor canst not lose it. Yes, your renowned name. Shall flight abuse it? Thy father's charge shall clear thee from that stain. You cannot witness for me being slain. If death be so apparent, then both fly, and leave my followers here to fight and die? My age was never tainted with such shame, And shall my youth be guilty of such blame? No more can I be severed from your side than can yourself in twain divide. Stay, go, do what you will, the like do I, for live I will not, if my father die. Then here I take my leave of thee, fair son, born to eclipse thy life this afternoon. Come, side by side together live and die, and soul with soul from France to heaven fly. Not only does Shakespeare vividly and unapologetically demonstrate the heroic and noble qualities of this father and son duo, but he does so in some of the most magnificent poetry found in any of his plays. It almost feels as if he's showing off his gift for language. And let's look at how this play ends, with Suffolk successfully convincing King Henry to marry Margaret instead of the daughter of the Earl of Armagnac, thus losing much political leverage and wealth in the exchange. And note also that Suffolk's only reasons for doing this are his own lustful self-interest in seducing Margaret and gaining power for himself. In Act 5, Scene 7, he says, "Thus Suffolk hath prevailed, and thus he goes, as did the youthful Paris once to Greece, with hope to find the like event in love, but prosper better than the Trojan did. Margaret shall now be queen, and rule the king, but I will rule both her, the king, and the realm." When we return, we'll look at some of the major turning points in Henry VI Part 1, as well as some of the correlations to the other Shakespeare plays. All right, now let's take a look at some of the major turning points and correlations to the other Shakespeare plays in Henry VI Part 1. There's no question that if Joan of Arc had not arrived on the scene to assist the French, the English would have had a much easier go of it. So her arrival has to be seen as a major turning point in the balance of power. Along that line, her ability to persuade the Duke of Burgundy, who was sworn to his nephew Henry VI, to change sides in the middle of a conflict was also a major turning point because it also led to the capture and destruction of Lord Talbot. In fact, the death of Talbot really signaled the end of the last of England's great military heroes. There's also the unfortunate action in Act 1, Scene 6, when, by the strangest twist of fate, the Earl of Salisbury is killed when a French master gunner's son aims a lucky cannon shot at the tower where he's standing. The loss of this great military figure dealt a terrible blow to the English side. And as we've already discussed, the fact that Richard Plantagenet meets Edmund Mortimer just moments before his death and learns the truth about his rightful claim to the throne makes him more than just a self-interested, disgruntled noble and someone who truly deserved to be the King of England. And finally, the fact that the Earl of Suffolk could successfully convince Henry VI not to honor his commitment to go through with his betrothal to the daughter of the Earl of Armagnac and set his sights on Margaret, the impoverished daughter of the King of Naples, drastically altered Henry's credibility with France and led to his failure to create any alliances with Charles. In addition, it greatly demonstrated to Gloucester, Winchester, and Suffolk how easily the king could be manipulated. As far as correlations go, Joan La Pucelle is shown conjuring evil spirits at the end of the play in order to gain power. We'll see this in Henry VI Part 2 when Dame Eleanor, Gloucester's wife, does the same thing and pays a heavy price for it. There are really only 3 women characters in this play: Joan of Arc, the Countess de Vorigny, and Margaret of Anjou. That's similar to the life and death of King John, where the only female characters are Queen Eleanor, Constance, Lady Blanche, and Lady Falconbridge. Of course, in The Tempest, we really only have one, Marina. But take note that even though they're few in numbers, they tend to be strong, rich, and remarkable characters. And one can't help but see some similarities in Cardinal Winchester and the power-hungry Cardinal Wolsey in Henry VIII. In this play, the Duke of Burgundy abandons Henry VI and joins the French. We also saw changing of loyalties in Richard II with Henry Bolingbroke. in Henry IV Part 1 with Harry Percy and his uncle, in Henry VI Part 2 with Warwick and Clarence, and in Richard III with the Duke of Buckingham and Lord Stanley. But there's also a biblical correlation in this play. In Act 2, Scene 3, when the Countess de Vornay thinks she's captured Lord Talbot, he surprises her by saying she doesn't really have him. She says, "This is a riddling merchant for the nonce. He will be here, and yet he is not here. How can these contrarieties agree?" Well, this sounds very similar to St. John chapter 16, verse 16, in which he says, "A little while, and now you shall not see me, and again a little while, and you shall see me, because I go to the Father." This is when Christ is about to make his resurrection, and he explains to his apostles that he will be going away, but they will see him again when they enter the kingdom of heaven. What Talbot is saying to the Countess is that you might think you have me in body, but you have no idea how powerful I am when you take on my entire army. When we return, we'll look at some interesting facts from Henry VI Part 1. In preparing to do this episode, I did some research and I came across some interesting facts. In the BBC Shakespeare version of this play, which aired in 1983, actor Peter Benson plays King Henry VI. He's about 39 years old at the time. However, in real life, Henry VI would have been about 4 years old when the play begins, 10 years old when he has his coronation in France, and 23 years old when he marries Margaret. By the way, Margaret was only 15 years old when she married Henry. In Henry V, we saw that Richard, the Duke of York's father, Richard, Earl of Cambridge, was beheaded for treason in the Southampton plot. In that play, it's explained that he was working along with the French to remove Henry V. The reality is he was trying to put Edmund Mortimer on the throne. Mortimer was the next in line after Richard II was usurped, but Henry IV installed himself as king instead. Unfortunately, the real Edmund Mortimer was imprisoned for about 12 years from the time Henry V became king until Mortimer's death. Although Shakespeare has Joan La Pucelle fighting one-on-one against Lord Talbot, the timeline is off. Joan was burned at the stake in 1431, long before Talbot ever came onto the scene. He died 22 years later in 1453. And finally, in Act 2, Scene 4, Warwick prophesies about the outcome of the War of the Roses, saying, "This brawl today in the Temple Garden shall send, between the red rose and the white, 1,000 souls to death and deadly night." Actually, he was way off. It's believed that approximately 105,000 people lost their lives in this conflict over its 30-plus years. By the way, in comparison, the United States Civil War lasted only 4 years, but cost about 620,000 men their lives. The difference is that war was being fought for the abolition of slavery. The War of the Roses began over which color flower somebody wore on their person. When we return, we'll look at some of the actors in the 1983 BBC Shakespeare version of Henry VI Part 1. All right, now let's take a look at some of the actors who played in the 1983 BBC Shakespeare version of Henry VI Part 1. Peter Benson, who plays King Henry VI, reprises the role in Henry VI Parts 2, 3, and Richard III, all in 1983. He also played the second gravedigger in Hamlet in 1980, and Clown's servant in The Winter's Tale in 1981. Brenda Blethyn, who plays Joan La Pucelle, Joan of Arc, also played Cordelia in King Lear in 1982. The outstanding Trevor Peacock, who played Lord Talbot, also plays Feste the Jester in 1980 in Twelfth Night, Jack Cade and the Sheriff in Henry VI Part 2, both in 1983, Bolt in Pericles, Prince of Tyre in 1984, Titus Andronicus in Titus Andronicus in 1985, and the first gravedigger in Mel Gibson's version of Hamlet in 1990. David Burke, who plays the Duke of Gloucester, reprises his role in Henry VI Part 2, where he also plays Dick the Butcher in 1983. He also played Camillo in The Winter's Tale in 1981 and Sir William Catesby in Richard III in 1983. Julia Foster, who plays Margaret, also reprises her role and becomes Queen Margaret in Henry VI Parts 2 and 3 and Richard III, all in 1983. Anthony Brown, who plays the Duke of Burgundy, also plays Walter Whitmore and Alexander Iden in Henry VI Part 2, and Sir John Montgomery and Louis the King of France in Henry VI Part 3, and Sir Richard Radcliffe in Richard III, all in 1983. Paul Chapman, who plays the Earl of Suffolk, reprises his role in Henry VI Part 2 and returns in Henry VI Part 3 and Richard III as Lord Rivers, all in 1983. Ron Cook, who plays the Third Messenger and the Countess Porter, returns as Richard Plantagenet in Henry VI Part 2, is elevated to Richard, Duke of Gloucester in Henry VI Part 3, and becomes Richard III in Richard III, all in 1983. In addition, he also plays Peter Simple in The Merry Wives of Windsor in 1982. Bernard Hill, who plays the Master Gunner and the Duke of York, reprises his role as the Duke of York in Henry VI Parts 2 and 3 and returns as the First Murderer and Sir William Brandon in Richard III, all in 1983. In addition, he also plays Captain Smith in the 1997 blockbuster film Titanic. Joanne McCallum, who plays the Countess d'Auvergne, also played Virgilia in Coriolanus in 1984. Brian Prothero, who plays the Bastard of Orleans, how would you like that nickname, returns as Edward Plantagenet in Henry VI Part 2 and becomes King Edward IV in Henry VI Part 3 and Richard III, all in 1983. He also plays Saturninus in Titus Andronicus in 1985. Frank Middlemass, who plays the Bishop of Winchester, reprises his role in Henry VI Part 2 in 1983. He also played Pompey Bum in Measure for Measure in 1979 and the Fool in King Lear in 1982. Tennille Evans, who plays the Duke of Bedford, Edmund Mortimer, and the French general, also played Sir Hugh Evans in The Merry Wives of Windsor in 1982, the Earl of Salisbury in Henry VI Part 2, and various roles in Henry VI Part 3, and Lord Stanley in Richard III, all in 1983. Derek Farr, who plays the Earl of Salisbury, and Sir William Lucy, also played Lord Say in Henry VI Part 2, the Duke of Exeter and the Mayor of York in Henry VI Part 3, and Sir Robert Brackenbury and the Earl of Surrey in Richard III, all in 1983. Brian Deacon, who plays the Earl of Somerset, also played the same role, and Smith the Weaver in Henry VI Part 2, the Earl of Oxford in Henry VI Part 3, and several roles including Henry, Earl of Richmond in Richard III, all in 1983. Derek Fuke, who plays Lord Talbot's captain and Gloucester's servant, plays various roles in Henry VI Parts 2 and 3 and Richard III, all in 1983. Angus McNamara, who plays various roles, returns as young Clifford in Henry VI Parts 2 and 3 and as Lord Lovell in Richard III, all in 1983. Joseph O'Connor, who plays the Duke of Exeter, also played Friar Lawrence in Romeo and Juliet in 1978 and Lodovico in Othello in 1981. Mark Wing Davey, who plays the Earl of Warwick, reprises his role in Henry VI Parts 2 and 3 and returns as Sir James Tyrrell in Richard III, all in 1983. Michael Byrne, who plays several bit characters in Henry VI Parts 1, 2, and 3, also plays the Duke of Buckingham in Richard III, all in 1983, and Antonio in The Two Gentlemen of Verona, also in 1983. Arthur Cox, who plays the Mayor of London, plays Lord Clifford in Henry VI Part 2, the Duke of Somerset in Henry VI Part 3, and Lord Grey and the Lord Mayor of London in Richard III, all in 1983. David Dacre, who plays Rainier, the Duke of Anjou, and Vernon also plays the Duke of Buckingham in Henry VI Part 2, and returns as Lord Hastings in Henry VI Part 3, and Richard III, all in 1983. Peter Wyatt, who plays Woodville and the Lieutenant of the Tower, plays Sir Humphrey Stafford in Henry VI Part 2, and the Duke of Norfolk in both Henry VI Part 3 and Richard III, all in 1983. Alex Gard, who plays young John Talbot, plays various characters in Henry VI Parts 2 and 3, including the Marquis of Dorset, a role which he reprises in Richard III, all in 1983. John Benfield, who plays various roles, returns in Henry VI Parts 2 and 3, playing the Earl of Northumberland, along with other roles. In addition, he also played the jailer in The Winter's Tale in 1981, and several roles in Titus Andronicus in 1985. Peter Aldwin, who plays the Second Company, reprises the role in Henry VI Parts 2 and 3 and Richard III, all in 1983, and plays a British captain in Cymbeline in 1982. And finally, once again, Paul Jesson, who plays the second messenger to the king, also played Clown in The Winter's Tale in 1981, Cloten in Cymbeline in 1982, multiple roles including the Duke of Clarence in Henry VI Parts 2, 3, and in Richard III, all in 1983, the First Citizen in Coriolanus in 1984, and Costard in Love's Labour's Lost in 1985. That means that he has appeared in 8 different BBC Shakespeare plays, to my count more than any other actor in the entire series. Believe me, I know that was a lot to keep track of, and I still couldn't include everybody who took part in these plays, but these magnificent actors did a first-rate job over 40 years ago to create a master set of all of Shakespeare's plays so that we can enjoy them today. The more you pay attention to these actors in these different roles in different plays, the greater appreciation you're going to have for the sacrifices that they made for our benefit. And I highly recommend that you get this DVD collection for your own library and enjoyment. It's one of the most valuable and rewarding investments that I've ever made in my life. And now let's get ready for today's trivia challenge, which is called General Knowledge. All right, now it's time for today's trivia challenge, which is called General Knowledge. Name the generals who lead these forces and in which plays. Number 1, the Volscian army against Rome. Number 2, the Venetian army against the Turks. And number 3, the Romans against Britain. When we get back, I'll have the answers along with some relevant lessons from Henry VI Part 1. Okay, now let's see how you did on today's trivia challenge called General Knowledge. You are to name the generals who lead these forces and in which plays. Number 1, the Volscian army against Rome. That was Tullus Aufidius in Coriolanus. Number 2, the Venetian army against the Turks. That was Othello in Othello, the Moor of Venice. And number 3, the Romans against Britain. That was Caius Lucius in Cymbeline. And now let's wrap up with some relevant lessons from Henry VI Part 1. Number 1, first, if you're a leader, make sure that everyone on your team is focused on the same goal. If you're in business, the front line serves the customers and the back line serves the front line. Ultimately, if everybody is looking towards serving the customer directly or indirectly, you're all looking in the same direction. Next, when you work as part of a team, you have to put the needs of the team ahead of yourself. Just remember that the needs of the many outweigh the needs of the few or even the one. And finally, it's better to work short-handed than with people who you consider indispensable. As Henry Ford once said, no one in your organization is indispensable. And if you have anybody in your organization who is indispensable, fire them by 12 noon tomorrow. I'm Dave Romeo, and thank you for watching this episode of Romeo and Shakespeare. Please join me next time when 3 bachelors decide they're ready to wed, but find out they'll have to wait a year instead.